Hello, David. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Doing great. How are you?
Doing pretty good. On vacation, so, not a bad way to be spending your time.
Yeah, I know. Again, we really appreciate you spending the time on this, especially while on vacation. And it's very
My
clear
pleasure.
you're passionate about authorization. We can say that at least.
Exactly.
Great.
Exactly.
So we are again. We just started the new space because we kind of like closed the old one, so it might be a bit slow until a few people join. Um, but again, we're still going to be doing the recording as we usually do, and people
Yep.
might come in as we do this. So let's get started. Um, it's great to have you here. You've been doing things in the IAM industry with authorization for a while. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, your career, and also what you do today?
Sure. So I actually started working in the authorization space back in 2004 when I was an intern at British Telecom back in the UK. And at the time, I didn't really know a lot about security at all. I didn't know what cybersecurity included or what authentication or authorization was. As chance would have it, I ended up working on a project. And back in 2004, it was the heyday of, SOAP, WSStar, API security. Before it was called API, it was called SOA security, actually, service-oriented architecture. And so we were working on all these new standards like SAML and XACML and WS Security, WS Trust, WS Federation, which I know is one of Vittorio's favorite standards. So that's kind of how it started. And then, a few years into that, I joined a startup called Axiomatics, who were focusing on fine-grained authorization using technologies like XACML and Alfa. And then 10 years later, a great ride, had a lot of fun. I kind of decided to switch gears and move on from authorization to go to the authentication space, which is what I'm doing today at Salesforce. So that's me in a nutshell.
That's great, and you kind of like gave us a fire hose of interesting things to talk about, right? You talked about SAML, SACML. We talked about like the early days of Axiomatics, fine-grained authorization, Alpha. So that's fantastic. Let's kind of like take this step by step, and maybe for people that are listening, what is authorization? How do you define it compared to authentication, which is what you're doing today?
That's a good question. Oftentimes people, when they hear the word authorization, they think of authentication because when you go online and you try to put in a username and password, you're trying to authenticate, and if you fail, you get the answer unauthorized. Um, I like to go back and define both authentication and authorization. So authentication in the broadest sense would be proving something about your date of birth, independently of my actual identity. So, if I walk into a bar and I want to drink, I have to be one, or depending on the jurisdiction, I have to be 21 or 18 or so on and so forth. So that's actually proving that claim. It's not really proving my identity. So that's authentication. Authorization is determining what it is you can do. More broadly, what an item or a subject, if you will, it doesn't have to be human, of course, what a subject, an entity can do on another entity. That's what authorization is, determining whether that should be allowed or not allowed. So it's a mixture of the identity information. It's a mixture of additional attributes of that identity. It's a mixture of the action that entity wants to do. It's a mixture of what the targeted resource or the targeted entity is, and potentially also relationships between the entity doing the action and the entity um, uh, being targeted, if you will.
I see that makes sense. So it seems like just knowing who you are in kind of like an isolated context is more an identity and authentication question. And then once you need to start interacting with the system, that's where you get these things called the subject and the resource, and there's kind of like an action or the target on those entities. So
Yep.
basically, this is, hey, can this subject do this thing on this resource or this entity? That's kind of like the typical way in which people might think about authorization compared with authentication, which is like, who am I, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you take a banking application, right, you go to yourbank.com, you log into the bank. So the first step is authenticating into the bank. And of course, in the realm of authentication, there's lots and lots of things to investigate. Do you want to do strong authentication? Do you want to do multi-factor authentication? So there's lots of things about authentication. But once you're past that first front door where we checked who you are, we've got a pretty good assurance level or assurance of who you are, then you can start doing things within the app or within the domain, within the bank. Okay, great. So you logged in. Are you a customer? Are you an employee? Are you a gold customer or a platinum customer? What do you own? Do you own bank accounts? Do you have a loan? Which loan? And what actions can you do on that loan or that bank account? So absolutely, authorization is kind of like the step that happens after you've walked through that first door.
That's great. And one thing you're mentioning, which might be unfamiliar to some of the listeners, is the term subject, right?
Yep.
People might immediately think, okay, I'm a user. Why are we saying subject rather than user?
I think it's just, maybe I'm a little biased, but in the ABAC world, which is one of the ways you could do authorization. So ABAC is attribute-based access control. We tend to talk about subjects, but a subject is at the end of the day a user. Of course, it doesn't have to be a human user. It could be a machine. It could be something else. It's kind of the same. It's the actor essentially.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And that's kind of like one of the things that like we talk about a lot. Like at auth0, we have like this kind of like machine-to-machine offering, right? Like there might not be a user. There's a worker, and it's acting as a subject, but it's not necessarily like again representing a human person or even on behalf of a human, right? That's great. So like now we're talking about authorization. You mentioned again like axiomatics. You mentioned all of these standards. Let's kind of like step back. I'm a developer. A lot of our listeners are developers. Why should I care about authorization as a developer? Like, can't I just have if statements in my code that check if the user can do something with an entity or with a resource?
Yeah, that's a good question. And historically, everything was in code, and a lot of it is still in code, right? I think there's a couple of reasons why you want to try to decouple your application code from the authorization logic, from the authorization code, and why you shouldn't be doing if-else statements. One of the reasons is just efficiency. You want to be able to write a lot of code. You're not great at security because an app developer should not have to be good at security. They should be able to delegate security to others. So much like you're going to be delegating encryption to encryption libraries or authentication to authentication libraries like Auth0, then you should also be able to delegate authorization to an authorization library that can do, and I'm saying the word library in the broad sense, right? Framework, whatever you want to call it, or service. You should be able to delegate authorization to that service because it's going to be done in a better way, in a better quality. It's going to save you time. That's kind of the number one reason. The second reason is you want it to be configurable. When you write an app, you get requirements from the business. But the authorization requirements are not always expressed correctly, and they can evolve very quickly. Some of the authorization requirements might come from the business. Others might come from compliance or legal. And if a new rule came in, take my banking example again. If there was a new rule that said, oh, well, if your bank account happens to be in, I don't know, at random, Luxembourg, you need to be able to, you can only do certain things, right? So that's a new authorization rule. You can't deposit money in Luxembourg if you're logging from outside of Luxembourg. Just random, stupid example. Well, if you had not used an externalized authorization framework or configurable authorization framework, then you would have to rewrite your app. That's very expensive. So you want authorization to be configurable, okay? There's a third item that kind of mixes with the second item. I did say there were two originally, but I guess there's always a third item, and that's compliance and visibility. Sometimes you'll be working in an industry where you need to prove that your application is in conformance or in compliance with different pieces of legislations. If you wrote authorization in code, it's much harder to prove that compliance. In my previous life, I had customers come up to me and say, well, we literally take screenshots of the C++ code of the given application and we share it with the audit team so that the audit team, compliance team know that we're doing the right thing. And that of course, is not great, right?
That's great. So basically, like again, you mentioned three things. You mentioned the fact that again, like this last one, I don't need to go through all of the ifs in my code
Yeah.
to be able to figure out who should have access to what. There's this notion of like being able to review this easily, and at the same time make sure that like you know who kind of like approves changes, right? Like there's this requirement around, hey, not all of your changes might be from your product team. Some of them might be from compliance or from other parts of the business, and you need to make sure that you track all of those. Um,
Yep.
One of the things that's also kind of like a big thing, especially around compliance, is like the notion of like auditing and knowing like who did what and when. How do you think about auditing in the context of authorization?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, Damian, because in the historical way of doing authorization, if you did it in code, you don't really have a good chance to do auditing. There's actually two types of auditing you could think of. There's auditing of what actually happened, so what access was granted, and there's the auditing of what could possibly happen or could possibly have happened. So let's take back my banking example. Maybe the compliance team at the bank wants to verify what customer Joe has been doing. If you have not implemented yourself that functionality in the app, and if you do authorization built into the app code, then you're in trouble. You don't have any traces. If, however, you had actually externalized authorization into an authorization framework or service or library, then that library should give you logs of what access was granted or what access was denied. It's not necessarily granted, by the way. And that can be used by the audit team to determine that Joe did access their bank account at 3 a.m. from Luxembourg and did withdraw 3,000 euros or whatever it might be. So that's the audit of what did happen. The other one is the audit of what could happen. That's interesting when you want to know essentially whether the authorization you've defined, I was going to say the word policy, but I'm going to try to steer away from specific implementation choices. But you want to make sure that the authorization you put in place actually corresponds to the original requirements. So you want to ask things like, okay, um, what if my user was trying to move money from A to B? Could they do that? If the answer is yes, then there's actually an authorization way. Or you could ask broader questions like, tell me what Alice can do, or tell me what Joe can do to reuse my user. So these are the audit of what can potentially or could have happened, and that's also a very interesting item to keep track of.
Okay, that's great. So now you started to kind of like reframe for mentioning the word policy. So let's kind of like start leading into that. What are the ways in which you can express authorization? Let's call them like the authorization model. Can you kind of like do a historical recap for all of us?
Yeah, for sure. Um, there's essentially three major frameworks out there, or three major models, I should say, to be more specific. The first one is ACLs, access control lists. It dates back to file systems, to Unix systems. It's so probably way before the 70s. I don't quite remember when. And it's mainly um, the most, I guess, the most common access control mechanism where you can choose what files can be accessed by whom, right? So this is also where you have the notion of mandatory access control that kicks in and discretionary access control that kicks in that can be implemented through ACLs. But then if you fast forward to the 90s, in particular in 1992, a couple individuals from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, got together and said, well, access control lists they're fine, they're great, everyone understands them, they're extremely fine grained, by the way, but man, they're hard to manage. They're really hard to set. They're really hard to audit. It's a real pain. It doesn't scale well. So we need something that scales better. And they came up with a model called RBAC, or role-based access control. And RBAC is kind of a natural thing for us to understand because role-based access control is based entirely on identity, on who you are. It's also based on usually a hierarchy of roles and groups and what you belong to. So it kind of corresponds to the way our society is organized, right? There's a leader or a CEO, and below that there's executives, and below that there's managers, and below that there's individual contributors. So it's a model that we understand really well. RBAC is pretty good. It scales better from a management perspective than access control lists. It's a great step towards the next step. But even with RBAC, when you want to do more specific authorization, when you want to do business-driven authorization, then you end up having to write code if you want to be more fine-grained. And that's where ABAC comes into play. So ABAC is attribute-based access control, also more or less defined by the same folks at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. In ABAC, it's a generalization of the fact that it's not just about roles, but actually it's about attributes. And attributes could be, they're essentially key value pairs, right? And they could be about anyone, anything. They could be about a user. They could be about an action. They could be about a resource. It's acknowledging the fact that not everything is a hierarchy, not everything is a role, not everything is a group, and that roles and groups are okay as a basis for authorization, but they're not enough. There's also another aspect. RBAC is what I'm going to call static authorization. I know that if you Google RBAC dynamic authorization, you'll find things because there's ways to do dynamic authorization with RBAC, but really RBAC is static. It's permissions that are granted to you at birth time. Notice, by the way, I said permission. So permission is something that exists in RBAC. You're going to assign a role to a permission or a group of permissions, but it's static, right? You're born with a set of permissions, and until someone assigns you a new set of permissions or removes permissions from you, you're going to be able to do whatever your role in your group gives you. ABAC is a little more subtle because it uses a broader range of attributes, which could be your date of birth. It could be a role, of course. It could be a group, of course, but it could also be data about the item you're trying to get access to. Say, my banking example, it could be that in ABAC, there's a role that says, or a policy that says, I can view the bank account I own. So you see, there is no role here. It's just an identity, I, and then an action, view, and then the relationship between the bank account and myself. I'm the owner of the bank account. But it could be an indirect relationship. It could be something like, I can view the bank account of my daughter. She's a minor. I can see it. So in that case, we're introducing new attributes, the notion that I have a daughter or a child, or I'm the legal guardian for another person, and the notion of ownership of that bank account. So that's essentially what ABAC brings to the mix. Now, I've heard other terms like PBAC, policy-based access control. It's pretty much the same PBAC. It's just that when you say PBAC, you kind of highlight the fact that in the ABAC world or the PBAC world, there's policies that tie these attributes together. But ABAC and PBAC are pretty much the same thing.
Okay, so kind of like the quick recap would be, we start with the ACLs, the typical Unix access control list. A specific user can do this specific thing on this specific file, but there's no kind of like meta reason why that can happen. They can do it because they can. Now, kind of like the next step to simplify management becomes role-based access control. They can do things, users can do things because they have a particular role, and that role somehow is assigned to them. And now then kind of like we have ABAC, which is, well, rather than just considering one thing, their role about a user, what if we consider user things, user attributes, but also attributes about the context of the request, maybe like the time of day, and also things about the objects in the system that you're interacting with. So you're kind of like going from like extremely simple in terms of like explaining why someone has access to kind of like more complex sort of rules, and that's kind of like where the word policy comes in. Does that make sense?
Correct. Absolutely, you're spot on.
Okay, and so like let's kind of like dive through these things a bit. Like it seems so ACLs are relatively easy to understand. Like this user can do this specific thing on this particular resource. That doesn't scale because it's hard to manage, right? You have lots of resources, and it's hard to figure out what a user can do. Now, how is this like? You mentioned RBAC, and it's very kind of like identity-centric. How are identity and authorization related? And especially, again, you've worked a lot with protocols. How do those kind of like tie in together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So identity protocols, things like SAML and OAuth and OpenID Connect, they tend to worry more about establishing the identity of the user. And of course, I'm forgetting other protocols in the mix, things like SCIM and even LDAP, if we want to go that far back. They tend to focus on the establishment of a user identity or the federation of a user identity in the case of SAML, right? And that's great because now we know who you are. And as a result of these standards and these flows, you end up with a lot of information about the user. It's not just that they are who they say they are, but you have potentially claims, right? And if you look in the OAuth world, there is a whole slew of claims that have been defined that describe the user. If you look in the OpenID Connect world, there's a notion of an ID token that contain information about the user, or there's a notion of a user info endpoint that might actually contain attributes about the user. They're not called attributes in OpenID speak, but they're quite literally attributes that can be used. In SAML, you can have assertions inside of a SAML token that can describe what the user can or can't do. So there's actually ways in identity standards to provide slightly better authorization. So, we'll talk about coarse-grained authorization, fine-grained authorization, and the stories that RBAC is coarse, ABAC is fine-grained. Identity standards like SAML, like OpenID Connect, because they can carry assertions or they can carry claims, they can actually make semi-coarse-grained authorization, if you will, like trying to meet in the middle. And what's interesting is you can mix that with authorization standards, things like XACML, Alfa, Open Policy Agent, or Rego, I should say, the language, because these attribute-based access control languages, they can literally consume these claims, consume these assertions, consume these attributes that come from the identity layer so that you can make smarter decisions.
Okay, so we're going from, I have all of my authorization logic in my code. I had if statements all around the code base. I was querying the database. Now I'm kind of like advancing, and I'm starting to say, hey, what if I kind of like had this at the edges of this application, kind of like a typical cross-cutting concern. I might be able to make authorization decisions based on someone's role, and that might come in one of these assertions or one of these claims in the token. I might also be able to make it on more than those things if I go towards like the ABAC model. What are the limitations of doing identity-centric authorization? Where will I hit a wall?
Yeah, so typically the line I draw is whenever there's a relationship, it's going to be hard to do it in identity-centric standards. And what I call a relationship is the example. I'll give you another banking example. I'm an employee at a bank, at a branch, and therefore there's a basic policy, human policy, that says bank employees can only work on, edit, view, whatever, customer data from the same branch. Okay.
Yep.
That's a basic human policy. It might be for compliance reasons. It might be for customer preference reasons. Whatever the reason might be, someone within the bank at corporate said,
oh, sorry. I think I accidentally muted everyone. Can you unmute David? 1 sec.
Yep. Can you hear me? I was on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
No
I was
worries.
trying to mute myself.
That's, my family tries to mute me all the time, so I know the feeling. So what I was saying is, so the human policy is you can only view data from the same branch. And by the way, you can only view it from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And to make it even more specific, you can only view it from a corporate device. So there's a few things that identity-centric authorization can't really tackle. Number one, the relationship. The relationship between the employee and the data. It goes through the branch. It's an indirect relationship, but we do have to check that employee branch is equal to data branch or customer account branch, to be more specific. And you have to think about things like, well, maybe the employee is working in multiple branches, so I need to compare that the customer is in at least one of the branches that the employee is assigned to. Okay, that's not something identity-centric authorization can do. And then the dynamic parts I mentioned, the time dimension and the geographical dimension or the corporate device dimension. These are things that identity-centric authorization can't really tackle. Remember what I said earlier? I said that identity-centric authorization and RBAC, role-based access control, they tend to be birth time authorization, meaning that we grant you the permissions that you can have when your user is created or updated, but it's way before you use the application. It's way before you actually get access to the data, right? So
we need to be able to infer all possible authorization scenarios from just looking at the user data. And that's not something that happens either when the context changes, again, time of day or geography, or when the relation with the object or something else changes, because you don't know how it's going to be used. And you would have to kind of like basically explicitly state all possibilities beforehand, which is not that trivial.
Correct. And so when you need to look at additional parameters like time, like relationships, like geographical information, there's only really two ways to skin the cat. Either you do it in code yourself, or you express it in an authorization framework, an attribute-based access control authorization framework that'll give you the flexibility.
Okay. And how does the statement you said earlier, I think, was around something like role-based access control generally is about like more coarse-grained authorization. You can do some semi-fine-grained authorization, but not quite. Whereas like ABAC gets you kind of like towards that finer-grained control. Can you talk a bit about, like, first of all, these kind of like fairly relative terms, coarse and fine, and also why that's important and what you mean by them?
Sure. So coarse-grained authorization is really about defining basic access to things. So it's what you define through the assignment of a role or a group or a permission, and it gives you access to a whole slew of things. Fine-grained authorization is when you can define a policy or a rule that will give you specific access. And when I say specific access, I mean it can go all the way down to the actual action that you want to do on the item, to that item, and it could be based on multiple parameters, multiple attributes of that item.
Okay, so this is mostly about like the scope on which you can act. Seems like maybe if you consider a typical SaaS application, you might have a role for an entire organization, or maybe a more technical term like tenant. You are either maybe an admin or a writer or a developer, something like that. But when you get into the, hey, I want to do authorization at the level where some users, based on some criteria, can change this particular field on the database, then that's kind of like clearly more fine-grained. And that's kind of like that spectrum, which is relative, but at the same time, considering the software out there, it's kind of like fairly differentiated.
Correct. And actually, you make me think that there's two aspects to fine-grained authorization. One aspect is how fine-grained the policy can be. And in ABAC, there's no limit, right? The policy can be super fine-grained. But there's another dimension, which is the enforcement. You have to be able to enforce at the level that'll give you the granularity of enforcement. So what I mean by that is, if you wanted to be able to do fine-grained access on a UI, so you're building a web page and you want to control buttons on that web page, having enforcement in a proxy or a web application firewall is not good enough, because it's not going to give you, it's going to be really hard to manipulate the HTML to hide or show widgets. So you have to have enforcement within the web framework. So it's always two things. Fine-grained authorization is always, on the one hand, the policy and the fine-grained nature of the authorization framework you use, but also the enforcement of that authorization. That's actually something, if you want to compare RBAC and ABAC, enforcement is handled by the app. So if you do RBAC, you don't really have to worry about enforcement. It's done for you, or it's up to the developer, really. In ABAC, you need a framework to do it for you. You need to have what we call enforcement points, or interceptors.
Yeah, and there's a very interesting talk about, we talked about this topic with some of the folks from Slack that deal with authorization, and one of the things that they do is essentially they make some authorization decisions on the Slack app in either the front end or the phone, mostly to decide what to display. But because it's a front end, you can't essentially delegate a decision all the way to a web page you're not controlling. So they do the enforcement of these policies, of these kind of like business rules on their backend and on their APIs.
Yep.
So again, we keep using the word policy. We talked about XACML, we talked about Rego, we talked about Alfa. Let's talk about policies. What's a policy? What policy languages and runtimes out there? Can you give us kind of like the lay of the land?
Sure. I mean, the baseline, if you will, a policy is just a plain old English policy. You might hear the word rule, R-U-L-E. I'm sorry, I don't know how to spell anymore.
It's
as
late.
well.
It's late in France. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, and so policy and rule are just the same thing, right? A policy is a statement that says what can or what can't happen, right? Policy, and that's interesting. That's another difference between RBAC and ABAC. RBAC can't be negative, ABAC can. So a policy will say a given user can do a given set of actions on a given set of items. So an employee can view a bank account in the same branch between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. That's an example of a policy. And notice that this is a plain old English policy. It is not a technical policy. It's written by the business stakeholders who get to define what can happen. I could have also said, by the way, if you are in an export-controlled country, then you cannot see any bank account, period. So that's an example of a negative policy that can get added to the first policy. Okay, the whole notion of policies is not necessarily that new. If you look at network access control, there was the notion of policies way back when. If you look at systems like Windows SDDL, there is something almost similar to what a policy is. So SDDL is Microsoft's attempt at ABAC in Windows Server. And of course, if you look at standards, you have things like XACML, XACML, goes all the way back to 2001. You have Alfa, which is a simplified version of XACML. That's JSON-like. You have Open Policy Agent. So it's not actually Open Policy Agent. That's the framework. The language is called Rego, R-E-G-O. And earlier today, I was talking with colleagues, and there's additional languages that are popping up left and right. So it's actually a very, very dynamic field. And I'm still catching up with the other languages. But at the end of the day, what they do is use key value pairs brought together to determine whether, yes, access should be permitted or access should be denied.
Okay. I see what you mean. So essentially, again, like when we think about policies, we're thinking about like the rules that define what should happen when a particular subject wants to perform an action on one of like these, again, entities or objects. And then there are ways of expressing that go all the way from like, quote, plain English, and there might be kind of like DSLs to translate that into something like, again, this XACML or XML-based definition for these policies. There's kind of like these new languages like Rego, like there's another one called Polar. I think there's like a library called Casper.
Polar. Yeah, Polar is the one that came up in conversation today. Thanks for bringing it up. Yep.
Yeah, and so one of the things I'm thinking about that, like as you speak, is like, and maybe this is not a good way of thinking about it. Could we think of like ABAC as a specific instance of ABAC where what I'm checking is just the like user.role attribute or something like that?
I don't really agree. You can definitely do RBAC with ABAC, but the frameworks are a little different in that ABAC typically implies runtime authorization checks. It typically implies that you do have a policy that dictates what can happen. It does imply that you have more flexibility and more visibility. RBAC, to some extent, it's just identity derived, and what when you give a user, take an example, right? So I'm at Salesforce. So when you create a user within Sales, the CRM tool, I can give them the role of CEO. I can also give them a profile. But what that role means, what the profile means, all depends on other configuration within the app. And this is all very obscure, opaque, right? Because it's all parts of code that was written within the Salesforce app, if you will. But it's really hard to be able to extract it and audit it or just react it. Whereas with an ABAC system, with a true ABAC system, you would be more easily able to look at the policy, analyze the policy, understand what it does.
Okay, that makes sense, and I really like that you said no. I love it when that happens, and especially because like people might go in that direction, right? And especially if you read like the NIST guidelines, the frameworks, as you're saying, for ABAC and RBAC are extremely different, and the degree of flexibility that a general ABAC implementation implies is fairly, I wouldn't say necessarily complex, but like you need to be very flexible. Where like with RBAC, most of those requirements kind of like are gone, so to speak.
But to your point though, you can definitely do RBAC authorization in ABAC frameworks, and also you don't necessarily have to use ABAC. Not everyone needs ABAC. I mean, if I take a very identity-centric use case, RBAC might be plenty enough.
Okay, so that's a good kind of like a good segue into my next question, which is, okay, we were talking about fine-grained authorization. We were talking about, hey, in these cases where there are like relationships, where there's dynamic context, which might be time, place-based, for example. It might also be like about other things, but like those are clear examples. You might need this notion of ABAC. What's the kind of like the other part of that? What's the typical architecture, or what are the typical requirements that you would expect to see in an ABAC solution?
So from a business use case, as soon as it always kind of goes back to the same thing, right? If you have a relationship, if you have a need to express authorization based off of a relationship, or if you need great visibility into the authorization framework and the ability to audit it, the ability to do access reviews, and the ability to configure it, then you probably need ABAC. But the biggest requirement is if you have well, two things: if you have a relationship and if you have dynamic aspects that cannot be addressed through RBAC. So going back to my banking example, if I want to be able to do authorization based off of the branch, right? If this was an RBAC model, I would have to define a role: employee branch 1, employee branch 2, employee branch 3. And you can see how that's not going to scale, because if I have 10 branches, it's okay. But if I have 100 branches because I'm expanding, it's not okay, because I end up with 100 roles, which is known as role explosion. So that's a typical requirement that it's like a warning bell. To me, it tells me go ABAC. But if you had things like time or location based access control, it's also an indication that you want to do ABAC. If you have requirements to have an audit trail of all the access that was granted or denied, it's another reason you want to go down the path of ABAC. Because with RBAC, given the access is done within the code of the application, then you don't really know what access was granted or denied, or rather you have to look through application logs to figure out what was granted or denied.
That makes sense. And so what are the components that the typical ABAC architecture requires or recommends to do this? We talked about some terms earlier, and we were, I would say, purposefully vague, but we talked about enforcement, we talked about like decision making, we kind of like talk about like policy authoring. So can you walk us through some of that?
Yeah, for sure. So in RBAC, the components, of course, they're all baked into the system, right? In ABAC, they're kind of decoupled. And the terms are not ABAC specific. They actually predate ABAC. They were used in other things like network access control again. But the typical architecture components are what I call the Ps, right? So you have the PAP, which is the policy administration or the policy authoring points. That's where you would manage your policies, okay? Then you have the PDP, which is the policy decision point. This is where you do the decision making. It's essentially an engine that consumes policies, that takes in attributes, and decides what can happen. So the PDP is the XACML term. In OPA, it's just called OPA. It's the OPA engine. So OPA, Open Policy Agent. But as a whole, it's just called the PDP. Then there's this notion of the enforcement. The enforcement is the policy enforcement point. And the enforcement is going to be very different depending on what it is you're controlling access to. It could be an API gateway. It could be a bit of code within an application. It could be a servlet filter. It could be a SQL rewriter if we're talking about databases. It could be, if we're talking about Kubernetes, it could be something in the control plane that will intercept messages that go between different instances. So depending on what it is you want to control access to, the policy enforcement point form factor will be very different. There's another component called the PIP, which is kind of my favorite one. It's the policy information point. And this is where, in a typical ABAC architecture, you have policies. And the policies state, an employee can view a bank account if the branch of the account is equal to the branch of the employee. Well, that's all fine and well, but the information that came in the question, the request, if you will, it only contained the user's identity. It didn't really contain the branch they belong to. So you have to be able to figure that information out. That's what the PIP is for. It connects to underlying systems, databases, REST endpoints, other services that will provide you the missing information. Hey, give me Joe's branch. Give me account 123's branch. This is what the PIPs are for. that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, and it's good to have like a succinct explanation of this, especially some of the material in the industry about these components is fairly verbose, I would say, and it's good to kind of like bring it down to earth. Like the PDP, it's the thing that kind of like runs the policy and returns, hey, the decision, true or false, to simplify. PEP, it takes the decision and decides what to do, right? If it's a proxy, it might return 303 or a 403 or a 201 or whatever it should
Yep.
happen. And you
Yep.
might be running it from different places. Again, we have the actual like authoring point, and again, there might be like a registry for policies or some sort of place where you store them. And then the PIP, and this is kind of like where it starts to get interesting, because like this is what connects to kind of like the underlying systems. And if I think about that, I'm like, okay, so the policies kind of like might need to read from different places in my services, in my architecture, in order to kind of like make an authorization decision. What are the challenges of that? Because I come from the reliability distributed system side, and I'm like, if whenever I need to make a decision that involves state, I start to get paranoid.
Yeah, there's actually two major issues. The first one is you have to have the data, meaning that if you're going to be using branch needs to exist. Um, and I remember this one customer who were writing a policy about a legal guardian, as a matter of fact. It was a banking use case, and the policy was along the lines of, well, the employee can view the bank account. It was not about legal guardian, I'm sorry, it was about block listing. So the employee can view the bank account of a customer, except if the employee is on the block list for that customer, which is a really good policy, right? The thing is, they were not maintaining that attribute in any system. So the first thing is, if you're going to use an attribute in a policy, you better make sure that it's defined and maintained somewhere, and that you have a process to maintain those values. Oftentimes, it's not an issue, but when you're implementing new scenarios, then it becomes an issue, because you have to agree as to who will maintain that attribute, who will govern the attribute, who will update the attribute. The second aspect, the second issue, speaks to what you were saying, Damian, which is, well, if you're going to be reading attribute values from PIPs, what about the performance? What about the reliability? What about the state? I think that's a bit of a non-issue. I think you have to design the architecture in a way that it does scale correctly, in a way that if you need to replicate the data in multiple places, that you do replicate the data in multiple places. I think if you go back to 2001, there was this sort of naive expectation that there would be one master database that would contain all the information, that there would be one master PDP that would contain all the policies. But we know that's not true. We know that we live in a very, very distributed world, for performance reasons, for failover reasons. And so if you want to be able to use PIPs, you have to be able to distribute the data or cache the data to make retrieval efficient and error proof.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's kind of like, and this is kind of like the interesting thing, which means, again, we this is a good approach in terms of like extracting things from the core of your logic, getting you all of the separation of concerns, the ability to author and approve changes and get auditing separately. But it also was created in a context where most application architectures were two or three tier applications, right? Like, and you had
Yep.
some middlewares, you had a centralized database, you could do all of your joins there, and now we have these largely distributed systems. We have microservices or service-oriented architectures, which again, all of those might work differently. You have different data stores within a single architecture. So that why like, it starts to kind of like put an onus on the team to make sure that authorization is reliable, has this low latency, and you need to handle all of those things around like replication and stuff. What other things do you see like maybe that might be kind of like seen as like ABAC challenges? Like, again, since it's been around for like 20 years, where do you see that it could improve?
I think that the single biggest challenge is a human challenge. It's around the policy authoring, the policy governance, the policy certification, um, also the overall ownership. Do you do authorization? Do you do enterprise authorization, or do you do authorization for a single application? Um, where do you draw the line between what should reside in application code versus what should reside in the authorization policies? What is that line between business authorization and business logic? These are the toughest nuts to crack. Be it open policy agent, be it that, be it something else. It's just a PDP. It's a commodity. It's an engine, right? Um, you know, so much so that if you look at the plane industry, right, they build engines for the planes, but the planes, the cockpit rather, is the magic in the plane, or the comfort of the cabin is the magic in the plane. The engine is going to be bought from a company that does engines. It's a commodity, right? I'm sure engine companies might not agree with me, but you get the point, right? The engine is just commoditized. The enforcement can also be commoditized. From an authorization perspective, just grab any API gateway. It doesn't matter which one you use. From a web app perspective, just grab any filter that works or whatever. You can commoditize the enforcement. The secret sauce, though, is really in the management of the policies, in the life cycle of the policies. And Open Policy Agent is actually a really interesting example of that because the enforcement piece and the decision-making piece, they're open source and freely available. What companies are competing for, the likes of Stira, the likes of Build Security, so on and so forth, they're competing for the management piece. They're competing for the visibility, the reporting, the access review features on top of the enforcement, on top of the decision making, on top of Rego, the policy language. So that's the toughest nut to crack.
Okay, and how do you, again, let's, when I hear you talk about this, which you're both passionate and very knowledgeable about, you've talked about XACML, and again, like for anyone that hasn't seen it, it's XML. We talked about Alfa, it's JSON. We talked about, again, now Rego, which it's not exactly this because it's not an imperative programming language, but like it's inspired, I would say, by Go and the Kubernetes ecosystem. So it seems kind of like, again, as the ages had gone by and new things become kind of like hipster or cooler, new languages have come up. What are the differences between those languages? Are there things that I can do with one that I can't with the other?
So XACML and Alpha are equivalent. They're just a different syntax. So like you said, XACML is XML. Alpha is JSON-like. It's not quite JSON, right? It's more like a mixture. It looks a little like C#/JSON, if you will. So it's notation that developers would be familiar with. Rego is YAML-like, if I remember correctly, and it's based on data log. The biggest differences between Alpha and XACML on the one hand and Rego on the other is that Alpha and XACML have a hierarchy and a structure, and they have this notion of combining algorithms, which Rego does not have. Rego is a bit more like a flat list of rules and policies, for better or for worse. So it's a slightly different style of policy writing. Overall,
go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. They're more or less equivalent. Overall, there's things I'm more familiar with in Alpha and XACML that I would be able to express more easily, like negative policies, which I believe you can do in Rego, which you could of course do in Alpha and XACML very easily. There's the notion of obligations and advice that you can do in Alpha and XACML, which are statements that you can return with a decision. There's also in Alpha and XACML, there's a clean separation between policy and the attribute manipulation or attribute retrieval. So policy in Alpha and XACML is just a comparison of attributes with one another or with values. In Rego, the policy can be that, but it can also be changing the value that came in, normalizing the value that came in, or it can be fetching an attribute from somewhere else. That to me is kind of mixing what the policy should do. And maybe that's my biased view because I come from the XACML world and I'm not familiar enough with Open Policy Agent yet in Rego. But it looks like Rego is mixing different things. The policy, the attribute retrieval, the attribute manipulation, and this should be separate because ultimately the policy should be something that you can give business owners, business stakeholders. They should be as untechnical as possible.
Okay, that's a good insight. I would like at some point to get like some of the creators and authors from this different languages kind of like over to share kind of like a bit about that philosophy when designing these and like what were they thinking about, what were the trade-offs. So I think that might make an interesting conversation in the future. Hopefully
Yeah.
I'll get a few of them to join. Now, one of the things that's kind of like out there, it got into like a couple of posts at Hacker News because companies like Airbnb and Carta talked about it. There's an open source implementation of it. It's like the notion of like this Google Zanzibar type of system. What are you familiar with it, and what have you seen about it that might or might not be interesting for authorization scenarios?
Yeah, so I'm actually familiar only a little bit about it, and actually thanks to you, Damian, for bringing it up and to my attention. My understanding of Zanzibar is that it still is access control list based, and that the main challenge that Google was trying to address was the ability to very quickly recalculate access control lists and assign them to objects in Google Drive or anything that is driven by Google, so YouTube and all the other Google services. So I think the requirement with Zanzibar was more about the efficiency with which you could recalculate access control lists and assign them to the different objects in a very highly distributed world. ABAC and XACML and Alfa and even Rego to some extent, they're more about fine-grained authorization in a policy-driven world. Yes, Zanzibar is fine-grained. There's no doubt about that because you can do very specific assignment of a given item to a given user. So it doesn't get more fine-grained than that, but it's still access control list based. It's very much based on the need that Google has of, a very highly distributed system of Google Docs, Google Drive, Google Slides, YouTube, and all the other services that Google provides. So I think Zanzibar is interesting in the sense that they started from a very specific problem statement, which was we have all these services and we have all this data in those services that we potentially need to share with customers and with people, or that customers need to be able to share with customers. So how do we go about doing that in a highly efficient way? ABAC started from, there's an interesting challenge, which is authorization. Oh, by the way, identity and federation, that's been handled by SAML. So how could we tackle authorization in the broadest possible sense? And that's how they came up, or how we came up at Oasis with XACML and later Alfa.
Yeah, and this is kind of like what, again, I've been researching and doing a lot of work on the area and working on different implementations, reading papers, and it's like there's kind of like this trade-off between like the flexibility like that you get from most or all policy-based implementations, where like you can express almost anything you want, but this notion of like you had to feed state into the policy engine in order to make a decision. Whereas like the main difference with the Zanzibar-like approach, and there's also another paper from Facebook called Tao, it's around how can we kind of like do more of like the map reduce model, where we move the ability to compute these permissions close to the data, right? So like they configure a way in which you say, hey, this is how my ACL, this is how my permission, my authorization model works. Push it close to the data, and then that allows them to both compute resolutions faster and who should have access to what. But at the same time, because they're Google, because they're kind of like co-locating with their clients, they get this kind of like very quick latency for authorization decisions. That is what they look for. So it's kind of like that balance of like how much flexibility do you need versus how much do you want to worry about the data aspects of authorization.
Right.
So like what would you kind of like, we're at the hour mark, and this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate, again, like the topic, but also like the historical context about this. Let's say someone was starting today and maybe it's a new startup, maybe it's a SaaS business, maybe it's a new system. What would you recommend to them? How should they start, and how should they think about implementing authorization?
So implementing authorization as they're going to be selling it as a vendor, or implementing authorization as they're building the next Airbnb and they want to tackle authorization?
Let's say they are the next Airbnb and they want to tackle authorization. Yes.
Yeah. Rule number one: don't do it yourself. I think much like you should not do authentication yourself, you should not do encryption yourself, you should not do logging yourself, you should clearly not do authorization yourself. I think you really want to write your requirements down in plain old English. You also want to look at the owners of those requirements. If it's more in the infrastructure space and more about developer efficiency in the realm of Kubernetes and Docker, then you look at technologies that live within that realm. So maybe open policy agent, maybe something else. If it's more in the business world or in the API world, business focused API world, then maybe you look at technologies in those space. So it could be open policy agent again. It could very well be something like Alfa and XACML. But you want to quantify, you want to clearly identify, articulate your requirements, and then quantify them. What I mean by that is oftentimes I've had customers say, oh, we need something that is super performant. What does it mean to be super performant? Are you talking about millisecond, microsecond, 10 milliseconds? What's the order of magnitude? And then when customers say, oh, we need something that's super fine grained. Well, what do you mean with super fine grained? Can you give me a couple examples of authorization requirements? So I would start with that. I would start with defining, and I guess this is a very bland, generic piece of advice, but defining your requirements, defining your business requirements, defining your authorization requirements, and see where that takes you. There is also a lot of good literature now by different analyst firms, the likes of Cooper & Cole, who've written extensively on dynamic authorization management, which is what they call ABAC, or Gartner, or even if you go to, shameless plug, if you go to Identiverse and go check out my talk, there's lots of good resources in there that point to other sites, other vendors, other technologies as a good way to get started.
Yeah, and so yeah, we'll be adding a link to the talk in the resources when we upload the recording. So it will be available, and we talk about a lot of these things, but you should go watch the recording as well. And I really like the advice, because it's always like oriented around use cases. I know Vittorio is listening, and again, another person that's always saying, hey, let's start with the use case, right? What are we trying to do? Let's not pick a solution before we know exactly what we're looking for. Because again, there are lots of things out there, but at the same time, and at least this has been my experience working on these topics, a lot of companies that are looking at these problems, they are maybe coming from an RBAC world, and they're starting to think more fine-grained, more relationship-based, or more complete like ABAC. And it takes a bit to realize kind of like the power of what you're getting into, and stop thinking just in terms of roles. So it's also a challenge from that perspective.
It is, absolutely. You have to start thinking in terms of plain old English, actually. And I've had a lot of customers, when they start the ABAC journey, they still think in terms of roles and permissions and groups. And that's actually, let go of roles, let go of groups, and just think in plain old English, because it's so much simpler. Yes, you will need roles, you will need groups, but it's not the end of it.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I do like the plain old English advice. This is, again, how I usually start my conversations. Like, okay, why should this user have access to this thing over there? Explain it to me using words that do not include the word role.
Yep.
Good. So again, like, thanks a lot, David. Again, we're at the hour mark. I really appreciate your time. This has been great. So for everyone listening,
my pleasure.
We'll be uploading the recording to YouTube, making it available on Twitter, on our Discord as well, AuthZ Lab Discord. And we are still to confirm the next conversation. We're still kind of like working with a couple of people that might be participating as guests. As soon as we know who it will be, we'll be announcing it on Twitter, or on my account, and also on the AuthZ Labs account. Hopefully you all enjoy this. And again, thanks a lot, David, for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks. Bye, everyone.